Oh, True War Encounters, Desmond Doss. They said saving lives needs a trigger. He saved 15 without touching one. The rope looked wrong. Corporal Jenkins noticed it first. How the hemp fibers had darkened where they passed over the cliff edge at Hacksaw Ridge, stained with something that wasn't just rain or mud. The May morning air on Okinawa carried the usual sounds. Distant artillery from the 77th Infantry Division's positions to the south, sporadic rifle fire from Japanese holdouts in the caves, and something worse, voices calling from the plateau above. Wounded men, still up there after the failed assault at dawn. "We're not going back up there," Jenkins said, his voice flat. "Captain Vernon's orders. We pulled back for a reason." Desmond Doss knelt by his aid bag, counting supplies. 15 bandages, 3 morphine syrettes, 2 tourniquets. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was somewhere else, up on that ridge where the voices were coming from. Behind him, the other medics waited in the relative safety of the staging area below the cliff, checking their own gear. Most of them carried carbines or pistols. Doss's hands stayed empty. The morning had started like any other on Hacksaw Ridge. Stand to before dawn, cold rations, the whispered rumors about another push to take the plateau. The 77th had been fighting for this ground for days, clawing their way up the coral face only to be driven back by machine gun fire and mortars. This morning's assault had lasted 20 minutes before it collapsed. The men who made it down brought stories of impossible fire from concealed positions, of friends hit and left behind because retrieving them meant dying alongside them. "Take it!" Jenkins threw his rifle at Doss's feet. The weapon landed in the mud between them, bolt still open, magazine loaded. The challenge hung in the wet air. "You can't save anyone if you're dead," Jenkins said. Doss looked at the rifle. He'd heard this argument 100 times, in training on Guam, during the landing on Okinawa. The logic was sound. The battlefield didn't care about his Seventh-day Adventist convictions, but logic wasn't what moved him. He stepped over the weapon. "Someone's got to get them down," he said quietly. Above them the rope swayed in the wind. Someone had rigged it earlier for supply runs. A simple line anchored to a tree stump at the top, dropping 70 feet to the staging area. Now Doss studied it with new purpose. The hemp was thick but worn, frayed in places where it had scraped against the coral edge. It would have to be enough. Private Hensley appeared from the aid station tent, his face pale. He'd been part of the morning assault. "Made it down with a minor shrapnel wound. There's at least 15 up there," he said. "Maybe more. They're all hit. Some bad. 15. The number settled over Doss like a physical weight. He closed his aid bag, adjusted his helmet, and started toward the base of the cliff. Jenkins grabbed his arm. "You go up there alone. You're not coming back." "Maybe," Doss said. "But they're definitely not coming back if nobody goes." He tested the rope with both hands, feeling how it had settled and stretched. The path up wasn't vertical, more of a steep scramble through broken coral and mud, with the rope providing the main support. At the top, he knew, lay an exposed plateau barely larger than a football field. No trees, no real cover. Just shell craters, bodies, and the constant threat of fire from Japanese positions in the surrounding ridges. "Lord," he whispered, "please help me get one more, just one more." Then he started climbing. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. Drill Part 2. The first man Doss found was Private Gorman. He lay behind a shattered tree stump 30 yards from the cliff edge, his leg torn below the knee. The wound had stopped bleeding. Not a good sign. Gorman's face had gone grey, his lips moving in silent repetition of something, maybe a prayer or his mother's name. His rifle lay 3 feet away, still gripped loosely by one hand. "Hey," Doss whispered, sliding into cover beside him. "I got you." Machine gun fire chattered from somewhere across the plateau. Doss couldn't see the position, just the impact points where bullets kicked up coral dust. He worked quickly, packing the wound with gauze, cinching a tourniquet. His hands shook. They always shook at first, then steadied once he started working. "There's others," Gorman said through clenched teeth. "At least 10 more. Maybe 12. They're all hit." Doss nodded, not trusting his voice. He improvised a drag harness from Gorman's own web gear, looped it under his arms. The trip back to the cliff edge took 15 minutes of crawling. Every yard felt exposed. Twice, mortar rounds hit close enough to shower them with debris. At the cliff, Doss called down, "Sending one down!" He rigged the rope through Gorman's harness and lowered him hand over hand. The hemp burned through his gloves. Below, Captain Vernon's men caught Gorman and signaled up. One saved. Doss didn't rest. He moved east across the plateau, following the sounds. Private Martinez lay in a shell crater, his arm bent wrong. Sergeant O'Reilly huddled against a coral outcrop, burns across his shoulders from a white phosphorus shell. Each rescue took longer than the last. The rope grew slicker with mud and blood. His shoulders screamed. The sun climbed higher, turning the ridge into a furnace. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at the cliff edge during the 4th evacuation, shouting up, "Doss, Captain Vernon says to pull back. We're calling artillery." "Not yet," Doss called down. "There's more up here." At the makeshift aid station below the ridge, Dr. Reeves worked with exhausted efficiency. Each man Doss sent down arrived covered in coral dust and blood, some conscious, most not. Reeves's hands moved through practiced triage, tourniquets, morphine, sulfur powder, while orderlies prepped stretchers for the long carry to the battalion aid station 2 miles back. "How many more?" Reeves asked an orderly. "He keeps sending them down," the orderly said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I've lost count." Back on the ridge, Doss found Private Kowalski curled in a crater, holding his gut. The wound was bad. Doss used his last morphine syringe, his last clean bandage. He whispered assurances he half believed while rigging the drag harness again. "You don't even have a gun," Kowalski said weakly. "How are you still alive?" Doss didn't answer. He didn't know. He just kept moving. By the time he lowered Kowalski, number 7, the afternoon sun had passed its peak. The rope showed dark stains where it rubbed against the cliff edge. Doss's hands were raw inside his gloves. His canteen was empty. The Japanese positions stayed quiet, as if even they were confused by the solitary figure moving across the plateau. Jenkins appeared at the base of the cliff, staring up. "He's insane," someone muttered. "No," Jenkins said quietly. "He's something else." Part 3. The 8th man almost killed them both. Private Dawson had been hit in the initial assault, lying exposed for 18 hours. He wasn't conscious when Doss found him near the eastern edge of the Hacksaw Ridge Plateau. No pulse in the wrist. Doss pressed his ear to Dawson's chest. There, faint, a heartbeat like a distant drum. He had no medical supplies left, no morphine, no bandages, no tourniquets, just his hands and the rope. Doss improvised a harness from Dawson's own belt and rifle sling, cinching it tight under the unconscious man's arms. The drag back to the cliff took 20 minutes. Japanese fire picked up. Single shots at first, then sustained bursts that forced Doss to shelter in craters between movements. A grenade exploded 15 yards north, another 20 yards south. They were finding the range. At the cliff edge, Doss rigged the rope with shaking hands. The hemp was fraying badly now where it passed over the coral. Dark stains marked every handspan. He started lowering Dawson, but halfway down the weight shifted wrong. The rope slipped 6 inches before catching. Doss's burned palms screamed as he gripped harder. Below, the orderlies caught Dawson and signaled frantically. 8 saved. Captain Vernon appeared at the staging area, his face set. Artillery spotters had been calling in coordinates all afternoon. The 77th Infantry Division's artillery battalion was preparing to hammer the ridge. Saturation fire to suppress the Japanese positions before another assault. Doss needed to be down in 30 minutes. "Get him down here," Vernon told Jenkins. "That's an order." Jenkins started up the slope. Halfway up he stopped. Doss was already moving back across the plateau, not down, going for another one. On the ridge, Doss found 3 more wounded clustered near a collapsed bunker. Private Lewis, Corporal Yamamoto, Sergeant Burke, all hit, all barely conscious. He knelt among them, his mind working through impossible logistics. 3 men, no supplies, maybe 20 minutes before the artillery came. "Can any of you move?" Lewis nodded weakly. Burke tried to stand, collapsed. Yamamoto didn't respond. Doss made a decision. He helped Lewis to his feet, supported him back to the cliff edge. Jenkins had reached the top by then, breathing hard. "You're out of your mind," Jenkins said. "Help me," Doss replied. Together they lowered Lewis, number 9. Then they went back for Burke, number 10. The rope was nearly gone, individual strands separating where it scraped the coral. On the 11th evacuation, Yamamoto, 3 strands snapped audibly. The rope held, but barely. Jenkins stared at the fraying hemp, then at Doss's bloody hands, then at the plateau still scattered with prone forms. His rifle hung across his back, useless weight. He unslung it, set it down in the mud. "Show me how you do this." They found Private O'Connor wedged in a crater, his legs shattered. Private Kim huddled under a poncho, shrapnel wounds across his back. Each rescue became a study in exhaustion and faith. Crawl, drag, lower, climb back up. The rope screamed under the weight but held. 12, 13. The sun touched the horizon. Artillery whistled overhead. Warning shots from 77th Division batteries. "We're out of time," Jenkins said. "2 more, Doss whispered. "I heard 2 more voices. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." Part 4. The rope broke on the 14th man. Not completely, just 3 more strands, unraveling with soft pops that sounded like distant gunfire. Private Henderson hung suspended 20 feet down the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge, while Doss and Jenkins held the line above, their boots digging into mud. The remaining strands stretched and groaned. Below, orderlies reached up frantically, unable to grab Henderson's boots. "Lower," someone shouted. "Just 3 more feet." Doss's hands were past pain, past anything except grip and release. He let the rope slide 1 inch, another inch. Jenkins matched him, their movements synchronized. Henderson dropped into waiting arms. 14 saved. The rope swung back up empty. What remained looked more like suggestion than lifeline. Maybe 40% of the original hemp intact, the rest a corona of broken fibers. Doss stared at it, then across the darkening plateau, where one last voice still called out, "Private Garrett, wounded yesterday, trapped near a collapsed cave entrance." "That rope won't hold another man," Jenkins said flatly. "It has to." They found Garrett at the far edge of the plateau, barely conscious, his leg crushed under fallen timber. Working together, they freed him, fashioned a harness, dragged him back. The journey took 15 minutes, while artillery continued its warning pattern. Shells landing 100 yards north, 100 yards south, boxing them in. At the cliff edge, Doss rigged the rope one final time. His hands wouldn't stop shaking now. Jenkins gripped his shoulder. "If this breaks, we're stuck up here." "I know." They started lowering Garrett. The rope held for 10 feet, 20 feet. At 30 feet, more strands separated with sounds like snapping twigs. The line dropped 2 inches. Garrett's scream cut through the twilight, but the rope held. 40 feet, 50 feet, then hands below caught him, and the rope went slack. 15 saved. Doss collapsed at the cliff edge. His vision swam. His hands were ribbons of raw meat inside shredded gloves. Jenkins sat beside him, breathing like he'd run miles. Around them, the plateau had fallen quiet. The wounded were gone. Only the dead remained, and darkness, and the certainty that artillery would come soon. "We need to get down," Jenkins said. The rope hung before them, barely intact. Maybe it would hold their weight, maybe not. Doss stared at it, this thing that had been at the center of everything, every rescue, every prayer, every impossible moment. The hemp was dark with mud and blood and the sweat of 15 evacuations. It looked like it should have failed 10 men ago. "Lord," Doss whispered, "one more time. Please. He went first. Hand over hand down the cliff face, the rope creaking and stretching. Halfway down, 2 more strands snapped. He fell 6 inches, caught himself, kept descending. At the bottom, his legs gave out. Captain Vernon and Dr. Reeves caught him. Jenkins came down next. When his boots hit ground, the rope finally gave way completely, the remaining strands separating with a sound like tearing cloth. The hemp fell in a coil at their feet, severed and spent. Captain Vernon stared at the ruined rope, then at Doss, then back at the rope. How many, he asked, though he already knew. 15, sir. Artillery began in earnest then, shells hammering the ridge they'd just left. The plateau disappeared in smoke and fire. No one could have survived up there. But 15 men had come down. 15 stretchers lined the aid station. 15 families would receive different letters than they might have. Part 5. What Captain Vernon's after-action report didn't say. Doss had broken down twice on that ridge. The first time came after lowering Private Martinez, number 4. Doss had crawled into a shell crater and couldn't move. His body simply stopped obeying. He lay there shaking while machine gun fire cracked overhead, while wounded men called for help, while the sun beat down on the Okinawa coral. He couldn't breathe right, couldn't think. The weight of what he was attempting, 15 men, no weapon, no support, just him and a fraying rope, crushed him flat. He'd wanted to quit. God help him. He'd wanted to stay in that crater and wait for someone else to take over, for the artillery to come, for anything except having to stand up and go back to the cliff edge again. But then he'd heard it. Private Kowalski's voice, weak and distant. Medic. The word pulled him upright. Not courage, not faith, just the absolute inability to ignore that sound. He'd climbed out of the crater and kept moving. The second breakdown came after number 11, Yamamoto. Doss had reached the cliff edge with the unconscious man, rigged the rope, and then his hands had simply opened. He'd let go. The rope had slipped through his fingers like water. Jenkins had lunged forward, caught it before Yamamoto fell. They'd lowered him together while Doss knelt, shaking, useless. I can't, he'd whispered. I can't do this anymore. Jenkins hadn't argued, hadn't given a speech about courage or duty. He'd just handed the rope back. 4 more, he'd said. That's all. Just 4 more. So Doss had taken the rope again. Now, 3 days after Hacksaw Ridge, he sat in a tent at the 77th Infantry Division's rear area while a battalion chaplain interviewed him for the citation. The chaplain had kind eyes and a notebook filled with other men's stories of that day, Captain Vernon's tactical assessment, Dr. Reeves's casualty count, Jenkins's eyewitness testimony. Tell me about the rope, the chaplain said. Doss looked at his bandaged hands. The burns would scar. He'd probably never have full feeling in his palms again. Small price. It almost broke, he said quietly. Several times. I kept thinking this is it, this is the one that fails. But it didn't. No, sir. It held. What he didn't say, how he'd prayed before each evacuation, the same words, Lord help me get one more, and how by number 12 he'd stopped believing the prayer would be answered. He'd just said it anyway, mechanical, going through motions, while his body and mind screamed for him to stop. What he didn't say, how Private Henderson, number 14, had looked up at him from the stretcher with eyes that knew Doss was terrified, knew the rope was failing, knew this rescue would probably be the last. And Henderson had smiled, actually smiled and said, "It's okay, Doc, we're good." That smile had kept Doss moving for the last man. The chaplain made notes. The citation would be clean, heroic, simple. A medic's extraordinary courage under fire, 15 men rescued, refused to carry a weapon despite repeatedly offered arms, displayed unwavering faith and selflessness. The words would be true as far as they went. But they wouldn't mention the crater where Doss had curled up and wanted to quit. They wouldn't mention Jenkins catching the rope when Doss's hands failed. They wouldn't mention how the prayer had become meaningless noise in his head, repeated only because stopping would mean admitting it was all impossible. "One more question," the chaplain said. "Did you ever think about picking up a rifle?" Even once? Doss met his eyes. Every single time I heard gunfire, sir. Every single time. The chaplain's pen paused. But you didn't. No, sir. Because if I had, I wouldn't be who they needed me to be. Part 6. The nightmares came later. Not immediately. Doss made it through the rest of the Okinawa campaign without obvious trauma. He did his job, treated wounded, moved with his unit through the final weeks of securing the island. The 77th Infantry Division rotated back eventually, and he rotated with them. When the war ended, he went home to Virginia, married Dorothy, tried to build a normal life. But every few months he'd wake up gripping the bedsheets, his hands moving through the motions of rigging a rope he couldn't see. Or he'd be at church, peaceful Sunday service, and someone would cough, just a simple cough, but it would sound exactly like Private Gorman's voice calling medic, and Doss would be halfway out of his pew before he remembered where he was. The citation had come through, the Medal of Honor. President Truman had placed it around his neck at a White House ceremony. Doss had stood there feeling like a fraud. All he could think about was the crater, the moment his hands had opened. How Jenkins had saved number 11 because Doss had failed. But he'd smiled for the cameras, shaken hands, said the right things, because that's what you did. The war was over. Everyone wanted heroes, not broken men who'd gotten lucky on a ridge in Okinawa. Years passed. Doss worked, raised a family, attended church, spoke occasionally about the war when asked. The story of Hacksaw Ridge became polished through retelling, cleaner, simpler, more heroic. 15 men, 1 medic, 1 rope. Against impossible odds. People loved it. Veterans nodded respectfully. Young men asked questions about faith and courage, what Doss never told them, how often he'd think about that rope, wonder if it was still there, decomposed now into the Okinawa soil. Wonder if anything remained of that day, except the stories and the medal and the scars on his palms. He never told them about Jenkins. How afterward, Jenkins had started carrying fewer rounds in his magazines, leaving space for extra medical supplies. How Jenkins had written to him once, years later, "I think about that rope every day, about how you kept climbing back up. I don't think I could have." Doss had written back, "You did climb back up. You went up when you didn't have to. That's all any of us can do." In 1976, 31 years after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss attended a reunion of 77th Infantry Division veterans. Captain Vernon was there, retired, grey-haired, Dr. Reeves, several of the men he'd lowered down that rope. They shared stories, laughed, remembered. Private Henderson, number 14, pulled Doss aside. "I never thanked you properly," Henderson said. "For that day. You don't need to. I do. Because I knew that rope was breaking. I knew you were breaking, and you lowered me down anyway." Doss looked at his old hands, scarred and stiff with arthritis. "The rope held," he said quietly. "That's all that matters." "No," Henderson said. "What matters is you held, even when you shouldn't have been able to." Later that night, Doss stood alone looking at a photograph someone had brought. The cliff face at Hacksaw Ridge, taken years after the battle. Trees had grown back, the coral had weathered smooth. No sign remained of that May afternoon, when 15 men had come down on a breaking rope, and 1 medic had learned that courage and terror were the same thing, lived in the same moment, carried by hands that trembled but didn't let go. The citation said, "Extraordinary heroism." The textbook said, "Miraculous." But Doss knew the truth was smaller and stranger. He'd been terrified. He'd wanted to quit. He'd broken down twice. And somehow, in the gaps between fear and faith, between prayer and desperation, between "I can't" and "just one more," somehow there'd been enough. The rope had held. 15 times. That was the real miracle. Not that he'd been brave, just that broken things, ropes, men, faith, could hold together long enough to save lives when nothing else remained. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.